Welcome to Cascade Circuits Simplified. What I have here is circuit number 2. It's a little more in depth, a little more sophisticated than the previous circuit. So looking over here at the schematic, the first thing to point out is the order of operations. That of course will dictate how you're going to draw and how you're going to plumb the circuit. So I show in here, I have A minus, A plus, in brackets B plus, B minus, and what I'm indicating here is B is reciprocating. And of course, it will reciprocate all day long until it gets a signal not to. So what I've set up is a timer here to time that out. And once it stops reciprocating, C plus, C minus, C will extend, C will retract. So a couple things I want to bring to your attention before I get into the circuit design itself is the previous circuit. We had two sources, source 1, source 2, which only required one cascade valve. In this case, I have 3 sources, which requires 2 cascade valves, and the way they're set up, they're in series. Of course, if you need 4 sources, there would be 3 cascade valves, 5 sources, 4 cascade valves, and so on. So looking at the design here, the 2 cascade valves, here's the first one, main source, and you can see the flow path is open, so source 1 right now is available as this sits idle or static, ready to go. And when we shift the first cascade valve from right to left, you can see the supply line here, source 2. The second cascade valve has an open flow path, and of course we have source 2 available. Once we shift the second cascade valve, then of course we'll have source 3. And in the end, we have 2 pilot signals here that will bring both cascade valves back into home position, which brings it right back to source 1. The other thing I want to point out here is when we look at A1 right here and B0, these are set up in series as well. So first of all, when you look at the 3 two-ways, they're no different than this 3 two-way here, T1 or C1. But the difference is here, they're still a 3 two-way, normally closed, spring return, cam activated, but they're held open, as you can see here. And the reason they're held open, if we look at A1, well, in idle position, A is extended, which means A1 will be shifted. It'll be held open at that point in time. We look at cylinder B, B0, which is right here, which is also held open at idle position or static. B is retracted, which means, of course, it's going to hold B0 in an open position. So looking at the circuit itself, starting right from the beginning, we look over here, we have our push button, our 3 two-way, and you can see here we have our main source. So as soon as we push that button, and of course we can release it right away, we open a flow path. Here's my pilot signal, which will shift my 4 two-way from right to left, opening the flow path to the rod end. A will retract. When A retracts, it gets on A0. I've drawn A0 down here on the right, bottom right. And you can see it's supplied by source 1, which is available. So we look at the pilot signal, it's going to shift my first cascade valve from right to left. And at this point in time, we're now at source 2. So considering that, source 2 will be plumbed directly to the 4 two-way that controls A, shifts from left to right, charges the blind end, A extends. So when A extends, it gets on A1. So we look at A1, and as I said prior, A1 B0 are set up in series. So here's source 2, plumbed into A1. That will feed into the inlet side of B0, which in turn, because the flow path is open, will pilot the 4 two-way for B to go from left to right, charging the blind end, getting B to extend. Of course, when it extends, it gets on B1. We look at B1 here, and it's tied into source 2 as well. So what will happen, the way this is set up, it'll just continue to reciprocate until, of course, there's a signal to stop it. So during this reciprocating process, we look over the timer. It also utilizes source 2, tied into the blind end. And what I did is, on the rod end, I'm controlling the flow coming out. As you can see, one-way flow control valve, the air itself is being metered out. It's variable, which will determine how slow or how fast the timer will travel, or the cylinder will extend, which will also dictate how long B is going to reciprocate. Once the timer fully extends, it gets on T1, right? We look at T1 on the bottom left, again supplied with source 2. You look at your pilot signal. When it's open, it comes around. It's going to pilot my second cascade valve, my 4-2A, from right to left. As soon as we do that, we open the flow path for source 3. So looking at source 3, it's plumbed directly into the 4-2A, which controls C, which means it's going to shift it from left to right. And when that happens, C extends. And C extends, it gets on C1. So we look over here, C1 is also supplied with source 3. The flow path is open. We look at the pilot signal. And at this point in time, what's going to happen, it's going to pilot both of these cascade valves back into home position, which means, of course, we're going to be back to source 1. As soon as we get to source 1, that's tied directly to the pilot, to the 4-2-way that controls C, which means, of course, it shifts from right to left, bringing C back into home position. And also it's tied in here at the timer on the rod end. It brings the timer back into home position. At this point in time, going through the schematic, the circuit is ready to restart. Obviously this happens relatively quick. So going here over here on the board to identify the components as they correspond with your schematic. To start off, here's our cascade valves. So the first one, main source. We come out of here, source 1, the manifold. Source 2 in series feeds the second cascade valve. We come out on the blue to the manifold for source 2. And of course we have source 3. So now going right to the beginning of this whole circuit within its design and how it's going to work, we look over here as our push button, and I'm plumbed into the main source. And as I said prior, I can plumb it into the main source or I can plumb it into source 1. Regardless, it's going to work. So as soon as I get the signal coming from the push button, I have a pilot here, which of course will get A retract. So A retracts and it gets on A0. So A0, when we look at the supply, it's directly plumbed into source 1, because that's available. We come out and there's a signal to my cascade valve to shift it. Now we go to source 2. So if you look up here on A, source 2 is plumbed directly to pilot my directional control valve to get A to extend. And of course, when A extends, we get on A1. So A1, here's my supply from the manifold. We come out of A1, and we're supplying, as I mentioned prior, it's in series to B0. Supplying B0, and this will come out, and it's going to pilot the valve, which is going to control B extension or retraction. And of course, when it extends, it gets on B1. Again, it's tied directly into the manifold. It also comes over in the pilot. So at this point in time, B will reciprocate, and it'll continue to reciprocate. Then we look over at our timer, and as we can see, the timer right here is plumbed directly into the manifold for source 2. So as B reciprocates, the timer slowly extends. How do we control the speed at which it extends? Our flow control here, metering out. So when it extends, it eventually will get on T1. T1 is taking energy from source 2, that's shown. We look here, and it's going to pilot the second cascade valve to shift so that now we open the path for source 3. And at this point in time, we have source 3. We look here, you can see where it's teed off. So the first thing that's going to happen here for source 3, it's going to get C to extend, as indicated here at the pilot. C extends, it gets on C1. We supply C1 with source 3. And then when we come out of C1, you can see that signal is teed off and it's tied into both cascade valves, which will send them both into home position. So once we do that, we now have energy again back at source 1. So what we did is we come off the manifold directly to source 1. That'll pilot for C to retract. Also, when we look at the timer, it's also plumbed directly to source 1. We'll bring the timer back into home position. So now, let's see the circuit work. And we'll go through this one more time. Thank you.